The saloon doors swung open with a creak that silenced the piano player mid-note. Every head turned toward the figure standing in the doorway. A young gunslinger with twin Colts strapped low on his hips and a reputation that had traveled faster than the westbound train. They called him Quick Draw Dalton, and he dropped 6 men in 6 towns across 3 states. His cold eyes scanned the smoke-filled room until they landed on a solitary figure in the corner, an old cowboy nursing a whiskey at a worn table. The man's hat was pulled low, his weathered hands wrapped around his glass, and he didn't even glance up when Dalton's boots struck the floorboards. That silence was what drew Dalton forward. In every town, men either cowered or challenged him. This old-timer did neither, and that kind of disrespect couldn't stand. Not if Dalton wanted to maintain the fear that kept him alive. "You sitting at my table, old man," Dalton announced, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. The cowboy took a slow sip of his whiskey, still not looking up. Around them, chairs scraped backward as patrons scrambled for cover. The bartender ducked below the counter. Even the shadows seemed to retreat from what was coming. Dalton's hand hovered near his pistol. "I said you're in my seat." Finally, the old cowboy raised his head. His face was lined with decades of sun and hardship, and his eyes, gray as storm clouds, held something Dalton had never seen before when men looked at him. Not fear, not anger, just a quiet, almost sad certainty. The old man's lips barely moved when he spoke, his voice a whisper that somehow carried across the entire saloon. "Son, you picked the wrong table." 3 days earlier, the old cowboy had ridden into Redemption Falls on a paint horse that had seen better years. Nobody paid him much attention, just another drifter passing through, his saddlebags light and his past heavy. He'd taken a room at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, paid for a week in advance with silver coins that looked older than the town itself, and hadn't caused a lick of trouble. His name was Elijah Stone, though he hadn't used it in almost 20 years. The wanted posters from those days had long since faded and been replaced by newer faces, younger killers. Men like Quick Draw Dalton, who thought speed and swagger made them invincible. Elijah had known men like Dalton before, had been one himself once, back when his hands were quicker and his heart was colder. That was before Sarah, before the farm in Kansas, before he learned that the fastest gun just meant you'd be the last one standing in a graveyard of your own making. He'd buried Sarah 6 months ago, tuberculosis taking her the way it had taken so many others. Their daughter, Emma, was married now, living in San Francisco with a merchant who'd never touched a gun and never would. Before Sarah passed, she'd made Elijah promise one thing: let the past stay buried. So he'd sold the farm, kept his guns wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of his pack, and started drifting. Redemption Falls was supposed to be just another stop, a place to rest his horse, and maybe find some peace in a bottle at the bottom of a glass. But the moment Dalton walked through those saloon doors, Elijah knew his past had found him anyway. Not because Dalton recognized him. The boy was too young, too green despite the bodies he dropped. No, it was because Elijah recognized the look in Dalton's eyes. The same look he'd seen in his own reflection 30 years ago. The hunger, the need to prove something. The emptiness that only seemed to fill when your gun was smoking and another man was bleeding out in the dust. Elijah had promised Sarah he'd leave that life behind, but he hadn't promised he'd run from it if it came looking. And when Dalton's shadow fell across his table, when that arrogant voice demanded he move, Elijah felt something old and cold wake up in his chest. Not anger, not fear, just a bone-deep weariness mixed with a certainty that had saved his life more times than he could count. This boy was going to draw, and Elijah was going to have to kill him to stay alive. Another broken promise, another ghost to add to the collection that haunted his sleep. Unless he could find another way. "You deaf, old man." Dalton's voice rose, sharp with irritation. His right hand flexed near his holster, fingers dancing with practiced menace. "I don't like repeating myself." Elijah slowly pushed his whiskey glass to the side and leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. Around them, the saloon had become a tomb, silent, breathless, waiting for the inevitable thunder of gunfire. "I heard you just fine, son," Elijah said quietly. "But see, I've been sitting at this table for 3 days now. Same seat, same time, same whiskey. Seems to me that makes it my table more than yours." A muscle twitched in Dalton's jaw. "You know who I am?" "I do." "Then you know I've killed 6 men who showed me less disrespect than you're showing right now." Elijah nodded slowly, his storm gray eyes never leaving Dalton's face. "I expect you have. Young man like you, fast hands, chip on his shoulder, probably killed a lot more than 6 before you started counting. Am I right?" The question seemed to throw Dalton off balance. His eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What's it to you?" "Nothing at all," Elijah replied. "Just making conversation. See, I'm trying to decide something about you, and it's important I get it right." "Decide what?" Dalton's hand hovered closer to his gun. "Whether you're a killer or just a scared kid playing dress-up." The words hit like a physical blow. Color flooded Dalton's face, red creeping up from his collar, rage transforming his features. Several men near the bar edged toward the door, knowing what was coming. "You son of a—" Dalton's hand dropped to his pistol. He was fast. Elijah had to give him that. The Colt cleared leather in a blur of motion that would have beaten 99 men out of 100. Dalton's eyes gleamed with triumph as his finger found the trigger, already imagining the old man's body slumping forward onto the table. But Elijah's hand had moved too, not toward the gun wrapped in oilcloth back in his room, not toward any weapon at all. Instead, he'd simply lifted his whiskey glass and taken another calm sip, his other hand resting flat on the table. Dalton froze, his gun pointed directly at Elijah's chest, finger on the trigger. But something was wrong. The old man wasn't drawing, wasn't even flinching. He just sat there, drinking his whiskey, looking at Dalton with those sad, knowing eyes. "Go ahead," Elijah said softly. "Pull that trigger if it'll make you feel like a man. But before you do, ask yourself one question. Why ain't I afraid?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and for the first time in his violent young life, quick draw, Dalton hesitated. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut, ready to snap. Dalton's gun remained steady, aimed at Elijah's heart, but his eyes betrayed him, confusion flickering across his face like shadows from a dying fire. "Maybe you're just stupid," Dalton said, but his voice had lost its edge. "Maybe you don't know any better than to be scared." Elijah set down his glass with deliberate care. "I know plenty about being scared, son. Spent most of my younger years afraid. Afraid of being slow, afraid of being forgotten, afraid of dying with nothing to my name but empty holsters and empty words." He paused, his gaze holding Dalton's. "But I learned something that fear never taught me." "And what's that?" Dalton's gun wavered, just a fraction. "That the fastest gun doesn't make you the strongest man, just makes you the loneliest." From behind the bartender, a gray-haired man named Dutch who'd seen his share of blood spilled on his floorboards, finally found his voice. "Dalton, maybe you ought to just walk away from this one." "Shut up, Dutch." Dalton snapped, but his eyes never left Elijah's face. "This old fool thinks he can lecture me? Me? I've put down men twice his size, gunfighters with reputations that—" "That what?" Elijah interrupted gently. "That meant something? That made them important?" He shook his head. "Boy, I knew a man once who'd killed 23 men in fair fights. Fast as lightning, mean as a rattlesnake. You know what happened to him?" Dalton said nothing, but his finger eased slightly off the trigger. "He got old," Elijah continued. "Not much older than you are now, actually. Maybe 30, 32. But in this life, that's old." His eyes went bad first, just a little, barely noticeable. Then his hands started getting stiff in the cold mornings. And one day, some kid even younger and faster came along, looking to make a name. And that was that. "That ain't going to happen to me," Dalton said, but the words sounded hollow. "No." Elijah leaned forward slightly. "Then tell me, what's your plan? You going to shoot every man who looks at you wrong until you're the last one standing? You going to sleep with one eye open for the rest of your life, waiting for someone faster to walk through a door?" The gun in Dalton's hand trembled, almost imperceptibly. Elijah's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Or maybe you're going to shoot an unarmed old man in a saloon full of witnesses, and then spend the rest of your short life running from the rope. Because Dutch here and every man in this room, they'll testify to what happened here. And you know what they'll say? Dalton's jaw clenched. What? That quick draw Dalton was so scared of an old cowboy drinking whiskey, he gunned him down in cold blood. The words struck deeper than any bullet could have. Dalton's face went pale, then flushed red again. His gun hand shook visibly now, the barrel dipping and rising as war raged inside him. Pride against reason, reputation against survival. "You're trying to trick me," Dalton said, his voice cracking slightly. "Make me look weak in front of these people." "No, son." Elijah's tone was almost fatherly now. "I'm trying to save your life. And maybe mine too, if I'm being honest. Save my life." Dalton laughed, but came out strangled. "You're the one with a gun pointed at your chest, old man." Elijah nodded slowly. "That I am. But see, you're standing there trying to figure out why I'm not scared, and I can see the wheels turning in your head. You're wondering if maybe I've got a hideout gun you can't see. Or maybe there's someone behind you with a rifle. Or maybe, and this is the one that's really eating at you, maybe I'm just crazy enough not to care if I die." Dalton's eyes darted briefly to the mirror behind the bar, checking for threats. There were none, just terrified patrons pressed against walls and frozen in corners. "But the truth is simpler than all that," Elijah continued. "I'm not scared because I've already been where you are. I've stood where you're standing, with a gun in my hand and murder in my heart, thinking that being feared was the same as being respected. Thinking that the next man I killed would finally fill up whatever was empty inside me. You don't know nothing about me," Dalton spat. "Don't I?" Elijah's gray eyes seemed to look straight through him. "Let me guess, your daddy was a hard man. Maybe he beat you. Maybe he just never said he was proud. You grew up angry, looking for a way to make people notice you. First fight you won. First man you outdrew, you felt that rush. Finally, you were somebody. Finally, people looked at you with something other than pity or disappointment." Dalton's gun lowered an inch. His breathing had become ragged. "But it never lasts, does it?" Elijah's voice was barely audible now, intimate as a confession. "That feeling. So you need another fight, another man dead in the street, and another. And each one makes you feel more powerful and more empty at the same time, until you can't tell the difference between who you are and who you're pretending to be." A sound escaped Dalton's throat, something between a curse and a sob. The gun trembled violently in his hand. "I had a wife," Elijah said quietly. "A daughter, a life worth living. But I threw it all away chasing ghosts and glory, and by the time I figured out what mattered, I'd already become a ghost myself. Don't make my mistake, son. Why do you care?" Dalton's voice cracked. "Why do you give a damn what happens to me?" Elijah was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face reflecting memories of choices that couldn't be unmade. Finally, he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "Because 30 years ago, there was an old ranger in a saloon in Abilene. I was about your age, maybe a year or two younger, and I had my gun pointed at his head over some fool thing I can't even remember now. He could have killed me. Lord knows he was fast enough, even at his age. But instead, he talked to me, told me I had a choice." Dalton's gun had lowered to point at the floor now, though his hand still gripped it tight. "I didn't listen," Elijah continued, his voice thick with regret. "Shot him dead right there, proved I was faster. Walked out of that saloon thinking I was king of the world." He paused, his eyes glistening. Found out later he had a grandson waiting for him. Boy was maybe 8 years old. The ranger was supposed to take him fishing that weekend. A tear traced down Dalton's cheek, cutting through the dust on his face. "I spent the next 20 years running from that boy's face," Elijah said. "From all their faces. Every man I killed had someone waiting, a wife, a child, a mother who'd never stop wondering why her boy didn't come home. And for what? So people would step aside when I walked down the street, so my name would be whispered in saloons." He shook his head slowly. "I can't get those years back, son. Can't bring back those men. But maybe I can stop you from starting down that same blood-soaked road." Dalton's gun clattered to the floor. He stood there, swaying slightly, looking suddenly very young and very lost. "I don't know how to be anything else," he whispered. Elijah stood slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. He walked around the table and placed a hand on Dalton's shoulder, a gesture so unexpected that several men gasped. The young gunslinger flinched but didn't pull away. "Then learn," Elijah said firmly. "You're what, 22? 23? You've got time to be someone different, someone better. Head west, change your name, find honest work. It won't be easy, and some days you'll want to come back to this life. But I promise you, son, dying old and forgotten in a warm bed beats dying young and famous in a cold street." Dalton looked up at him, eyes red and searching. "What if I can't? What if this is all I am?" "Then you're already dead," Elijah said quietly. "You just haven't fallen yet." For a long moment, they stood there, the old gunfighter and the young one, past and future suspended in the smoky air of a frontier saloon. Then Dalton bent slowly, picked up his gun, and holstered it with shaking hands. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Don't apologize to me," Elijah replied. "Apologize to the man you're going to be tomorrow." Dalton nodded once, turned on his heel, and walked toward the saloon doors. Every eye in the room watched him go. At the threshold, he paused and looked back at Elijah. "What was his name?" Dalton asked. "The Ranger, Samuel Stone," Elijah said quietly. "He was my father." Understanding flooded Dalton's face. The weight of it, the circle of violence and redemption, the cost of mercy and the price of revenge. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect, then pushed through the doors and disappeared into the afternoon sun. The saloon remained silent for several heartbeats. Then Dutch cleared his throat and said, "Drinks on the house, Mr. Stone." Elijah returned to his table and sat down heavily, feeling every one of his years. Through the window, he watched Dalton mount his horse and ride west, toward the mountains, toward whatever future he could carve from the wreckage of his past. "Godspeed, son," Elijah murmured, raising his glass to the empty doorway. "Godspeed." Outside, the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson as another day bled into memory in the dying West, where legends were made and broken with equal measure, and where sometimes, just sometimes, a life could be saved with nothing more than truth and a second chance. The end. The bravest thing a gunfighter can do isn't drawing faster. It's holstering his weapon and walking away.